Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this Fusion21 webinar, Building a Safer Future, Post-Construction BIM. This is a series of webinars that we've been putting together, and I'm delighted that so many of you are able to join us this afternoon. My name's Andrew Gray. I'm the Member Relationships Manager at Fusion21, and I have the pleasure of chairing today's session. Few organisations have really embraced BIM, and again today, few organisations have widely adopted building information modelling following construction handover. In this webinar, we'll look at the benefits and challenges of using BIM after construction is completed. We'll cover the golden thread, assessing and maintaining data, and finally, we'll discuss the best way to roll out BIM in a most cost-effective way. If you're unfamiliar with these webinars, I'll just go through a few instructions for you. You can minimize the panel on your right-hand side by clicking the orange arrow. If you're having difficulty in looking in the audio, then again, you can adjust your audio settings clicking on the audio button, though sometimes if you are still having difficulties, we often find the classic turn it off and turn it back on again seems to work for everyone. If you're still having difficulties, then please let us know, post a question in the question box, and one of the Fusion staff will hopefully be able to get in touch with you and hopefully sort it out. And as far as questions are concerned, we do want to make these sessions as interactive as possible. And whilst you, the audience, are on mute, we hope that you can still take part in the webinar by clicking on the question box and asking questions to the panel as we go along. We'll keep a note of all the questions that we have, and we'll get through them. If we don't get them through the seminar, then we'll make sure that we address any of the questions after the event. So I'm now left with the great task of introducing today's panel. So we have Richard Hands and Brent Rees, who are both partners at Reid & Partners. We then have Reid Cunningham, who's the director of BIM FM, and to join the panel for the Q&A session later, but not doing a presentation, we have Phil Woodhead, category manager at Fusion21. So hopefully you will all find today's event and webinar successful, insightful, and hopefully really good fun. So without further ado, having set that up, Richard, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed. So welcome everybody. I'm Richard Hand, one of the partners at Reid, responsible for our residential and housing sector, managing an office and also looking after our property consultancy, so that keeps me out of trouble usually. I'd also like to introduce Brent Rees, who is partner responsible for our BIM management team, and you'll be hearing from Brent in his expert capacity about BIM during the course of the presentation. So with regards to, sorry, I just need to head back there one slide if we can do that.
Oh, you've going too far.
There we go. There we go. So
I said it would be a bit of fun.
Yes, for those of you who aren't familiar with Reid, we're a multidisciplinary property and construction consultancy, over 600 staff and 11 offices now. That encompasses a range of surveying, architectural engineering and other specialist disciplines, of which BIM management is one. That array of staff means that we do an awful lot of design, all of our design for significant projects is now undertaken using 3D modelling using Revit software. So we abandoned CAD and 2D information quite some time ago, which led us neatly into the ability to effectively then think about how BIM could be used in the context of effective asset management. And our strategic advisory teams continue to provide advice. My specialist subject is, as previously mentioned, housing and residential work, albeit clearly BIM was originally introduced by government to focus on their estate as a mandated objective and on larger developments. But a number of our housing clients are now coming to us saying, what can we do? How can we take advantage of this in the context of the agenda that's occurred post-Grenfell? In order to facilitate effective BIM, we also undertake a lot of condition and measured survey work and other specialist surveys, more of which we will discuss later. So a couple of examples of projects that we're working on. Haringey, for example, we are working with a client who has an estate of properties in North London that are constructed from large panel system methodology, and we're working to strengthen those blocks, to demolish some and to extend others as part and parcel of a larger refurbishment program. So we are using BIM modelling on 1960s constructed blocks to actually consider how we can best undertake that refurbishment, and also designing new extension blocks using Revit systems as well. And at that point, I'll pass across to Brent, who will give you a bit more insight.
Thanks, Richard, and good afternoon, everyone. So just to build on what Richard said there about projects and clients, so we've put a few client logos there, and they aren't, strictly speaking, all the clients that Ridge work for. These are some of the logos that Haringey is a client that Richard works with, for instance, but some of the other clients referenced there, sorry, are clients that my digital engineering BIM team work with. And I just wanted to reference some of these because we provide a range of services from BIM coordination, information management, 4D planning, Firestop assessments, which I'll go into more later, and we cross over and we cross-sell into some other parts of our business with regards to asset tagging and laser scanning as well. But some of the projects I've referenced there, you know, they're both public and private sector. They're refurbishments and new build projects, and some sort of different examples there, like the Museum of London shown at the top, and some of the high-rise residential schemes for Ballymore and Moda Living at the bottom. But the less glamorous example in the middle of the image there is electric vehicle battery manufacturing facility in the Midlands, where we provided BIM coordination, information management, 4D planning. We provided asset tagging in there, and we're also providing a service through the initial parts of operation where we're updating models, we're updating COBie data sets for the client for a year, such that they can receive the data and learn how to use the data as they move and start to operate the building into the first stage of operation. The next slide I want to talk about really was about BIM standards and how they've evolved over the years. And level 2 BIM was really the thing that the government mandated, and the standard that responded to that was PS 1192 Part 2 2013. And there's a big cross through that at the moment because that's recently been superseded by ISO 19650. And whilst the principles are largely the same, the new standard is set for the international scene. So if we just look at level 2 BIM quickly, the best way to define it in a nutshell, and lots of people will debate this. So if level 0 describes a traditional way of delivering a project with paper or CAD-based deliverables, then level 1 would describe the use of 3D models, but no robust processes around how that information is exchanged or used. Then level 2 BIM would describe the use of 3D models to deliver a project, but with structures and procedures and processes in place to deliver a structured data set to the client at the end. What I'm going to talk through on this slide is the evolution of BIM across the sort of last 10 years or so. So just under 10 years ago, sorry, in 2011, the government mandated the use of BIM and later became known as level 2 BIM from 2016, but that announcement was made in 2011, and the industry had the next 5 years really to adjust to that and try and understand how we might work with that. And whilst the mandate was originally set for centrally procured government projects, so the public sector projects, the actual effects of that trickled down through the public sector and down into the private sector as well, and you'll see an even split of use across both sectors now, I'd suggest. And then across that period, that's really evolved into lots of different bodies and lots of different parties that have helped shape and drive on the development of BIM. And we now have the UK BIM Alliance, which have also helped shape the current standards through ISO 19650. And along the bottom there is just a bit of our history and about how we've evolved as a business during that time as well. So to go into detail then about ISO 19650 and what that means in terms of BIM standards. Again, like I said, these are also key components of level 2 BIM, but some of the terminology is subtly different. So I'm going to talk through 5 key components of ISO 19650 or BIM in accordance with ISO 19650, which will be very similar to level 2 BIM. So the EIR, the exchange information requirements, is a really key deliverable at the very start of a project. So before procuring any consultants or any professional services, the client should have a good idea of what they want to achieve from BIM and have that itemized in an EIR document, which is used as part of the tender process. The next component is a pre-appointment BIM execution plan. So where those tendering parties have received that EIR, they should respond to the client or those evaluating the tender returns with a pre-appointment BIM execution plan, which summarises that organisation's approach to meeting the requirements of the EIR. Then once appointed, that will then be collated and developed into an appointments BIM execution plan, and that will take into account all of the different organisations that are getting appointed at that point and develop that into a document which states how the team are going to work together to deliver the requirements of the client. Fourth key component, and this is relevant across all stages, is a common data environment. So a central platform for exchanging project information. But that, we think of things like A-Site and Viewpoint for projects and platforms like that as common data environments, but it really extends further than that, about setting principles around how information is named and the statuses and suitabilities that they receive, so we know when information is appropriate to be used or not. And the final facet that I'm going to talk about with regards to kind of definition, and there are plenty more that we could delve into, but I think these are the best, highest level examples is COBE. So a deliverable that is driven by models initially, but that can be handed over in either model format or in Excel format or an IFC format, and typically lists maintainable assets for that building and key bits of information about those assets. And the reason this is part of the level 2 BIM mandate is because the government, who is a client that procures lots of different buildings in lots of different locations through lots of different supply chains, wanted to standardize the data that they were getting across those projects. So this, they felt, was the mechanism for doing that.
So with regards to good practice and post-construction, we think this is all about you as clients knowing your portfolio. It may be a single building, it might be a university estate, it could be several thousand houses, for example. The principles of what we're going to discuss applies to all of those. And in the post-Grenfell environment, which we are currently within, there's a very clear mandate to understand your risks and then to mitigate those. And consequently, we are now being guided by things like the government's building safety programme, where you see comments like the one included in the middle bullet point about social housing being made safe and decent. All of that aligns to Hackett's golden thread. And we could talk about that for the rest of the afternoon, but we won't do that because we're here just to talk about BIM. In terms of BIM having a key role to play as an information management tool in order to prove the golden thread, we think that's absolutely invaluable, and we recommend the adoption of BIM and related information systems to actually assist with portfolio management. In order to get to that point, you need to have undertaken potentially surveys, intrusive investigations, testing by specialists in order to make sure that you can fully populate your models in the most effective way and therefore make the most out of effective facilities and asset management. And Reid will be focusing in upon facilities later on in the presentation. So we talk about knowing your assets as asset intelligence, and as part and parcel of the risk assessment process, we could translate that into Hackett speak and say development of a safety case, knowing who's responsible for what the key issues are and how they're being managed and mitigated, all of which fundamentally is just good practice. With regards to our housing clients, we're having discussions at the moment, and we're suggesting that high rise and high risk is probably the best starting point for consideration. It's very difficult for many clients to contemplate retrospectively measuring and developing BIM models for something as simple as a detached house, but your high-rise block probably does represent a first opportunity to get stuck in with that. More complicated estates, such as educational or commercial properties, lend themselves much more easily to the BIM environment than housing, but nonetheless, BIM within housing definitely has a place. It could consider, for example, any non-traditionally constructed properties, including the large panel system estates that we're using BIM on for Haringey at this moment in time. Also, there are a few headliners there that we're all very focused on in the asset management world at the moment, including cladding and compartmentation, making sure we know what is there, whether it's combustible, whether it's safe to be retained on that building or not, and indeed the wider fire safety agenda. It's very important that we make sure that you have appropriate fire risk assessments on all of your properties, and that's at the highest level, including investigations rather than just the purely visual approach to fire risk, which has been fairly common, especially within the housing world of late. And not forgetting the wider compliance agenda, so not forgetting things like electrical risk, gas, asbestos, the list goes on, doesn't it? So BIM is an ideal environment to link the knowledge about each of those compliance areas and what you are doing to within a modelled environment. Equally, an ideal opportunity to actually define complicated or complex mechanical and electrical plants and equipment. All of that information has been usefully created for you in new build development models typically, and making sure that you make the most of that with regards to subsequent and ongoing asset management. So does BIM apply to new or existing assets? Well, we think it is effectively both. It's horses for courses, starting with your most complicated and highest risk buildings. And clearly, as a client, you should be making sure that BIM and Revit 3D, 4D modelling is actually part and parcel of your briefing for any substantial new developments. As designers, we don't use anything else now, therefore it's something that is readily available to you, but actually rarely requested in several instances. For the existing assets, it's perfectly possible to create those into a 3D model by point cloud technology, and our geospatial consultants ran around the country with very expensive looking backpacks in order to be able to do that on a regularized basis, and actually creating some very technical and very accurate detailed models of very complex buildings, including, for example, historical barn structures, which would be a complete nightmare for a building surveyor to head in and do with a straight ruler. We think all of those models should definitely show key attributes, including structure related to compartmentation. And there's also an opportunity to align and add in asset taggings, such as your complicated, complex M&E. And equally, those tags can also be associated with maintenance of servicing records, all referenced through your BIM modelling processes. Alignment with an asbestos register is another classic opportunity that could be taken, as opposed to that sitting as a separate file and being of very limited use in a joined up environment. So some potential issues that we have experienced or seen in respect of BIM is typically starts with client briefing. So what are the requirements for a BIM project? And they can be substantially variable, different interpretations, different standards, or completely overlooked. And Brent and his team are there to be able to assist with regards to that effective management and actually obtaining and then producing data that has substantial value moving into subsequent asset management and facilities management. Should it be for all of your stock or all of your portfolio? Ultimately, in time, we think the answer to that is yes. I mentioned earlier, in the housing environment, are you going to rush out and do all of your general needs, low-rise stock? Probably not. That is not where this is intended to start. So do look at the high-rise, high-risk buildings to start with. There's definitely an issue with regards to client access to software and the skills to drive that. So as designers, we employ a very many number of very expensive Revit licenses throughout the business. Not many client organizations do the same. They want the information that is output from the models. However, in order to be able to manage and maintain the data, a system such as Revit is going to be necessary, or you work with a third party, the likes of us, for example, in order to do that maintenance and management of the modeling for you. It's also important to make sure that you have a good interface with your servicing and CAFM systems, for example, and again, lots more about that coming up.
Thanks.
At that point, I'll hand back to Brent.
Cheers. Conscious of time, so I've got a few more slides to run through about our approach to fire stopping. So this was really born out of issues that we were seeing on some of our projects initially, and the complexity that comes with designing, specifying, and managing fire stops through the kind of delivery of a project. But actually, some subsequent events have then brought into focus how important this is for those operating a building. We've been lucky enough as well to have won some awards with relation to this process as well. So I'll touch on some stuff about this process. But one of the things that's really brought this into focus is the Grenfell disaster, the issue of the Hackett report, the idea of the golden thread and that flow of information from a project to the client. And I know Reid is going to touch a bit more on that, and has got some nice graphics around that. But Part B, and this isn't a new requirement in Part B, but Part B needs all proprietary sealing systems to be shown by test performed for their required fire resisting period, which means if you put a fire stop in a wall or into a floor, it must have been shown in a laboratory test to perform for that period, which sounds straightforward, but only a finite number of instances have been tested. So I'll talk more about the complexity around that in due course. So I'm going to talk through how this applies at different RBA stages and how this works in terms of flow of information through to the operation stages. But in order for this to work optimally, we would recommend that, through stages 0 and 1, it's about making sure that scopes are right and design responsibilities are right, so that we're placing responsibility, for example, on the architect for nominating the Firestop products. We're placing responsibility on M&E engineers for sizing and positioning builders work openings in models. We're placing responsibility on a party, probably the architect, for modelling fire stops within those builders work openings, and responsibility on the M&E engineers for spacing their services in accordance with test data of a product nominated by the architect. I'll come on to that, the importance of that shortly. So through stages 2 to 4, like the sort of bulk of the design stages, and it may be shorter depending on when the contract is procured exactly. But what we're trying to do here is agree the products to be used, because different manufacturers will have different test data and therefore will want services spaced differently. The spatial arrangements are really important. So that the design team needs to have their eyes open about any pinch points or any areas which may be affected by builders work openings increasing in size, like corridors or areas above ceilings. And what we look to do during this period is run automated rule-based checks using Celebri. So it's an extension of our clash detection processes, but actually we've got rules that are aligned with test data from Firestop manufacturers, which automates sort of checking to make sure that the design and specification is compliant. So to expand on that a little bit more, so using multidisciplinary models, we can use the rules to say, go and find all the building services in the project. Now go and find all the fire-rated walls in the project, and now tell me how many building services are passing through fire-rated walls. And if builders work openings have been modelled, and if Firestops have been modelled, we can use the same rules to check for things penetrating those things as well. So that's what we do with the rule set in the first instance. And once we've done that, we can say, okay, now we've got these, now we know how many services are penetrating fire-rated fabric. Tell me what the distances are between the edges of things like cable trays to the edge of the opening to make sure there's enough Firestop product around that to make it compliant, or if there's enough space between a cable tray and, say, another pipe penetrating the same Firestop, again, to ensure there's enough product around it. So this is about checking for and demonstrating compliance. And a really important part during these design stages is getting to a point where we've itemized the number of Firestops, because it's quite uncommon during design to have a complete clear handle on the exact number of Firestops in a building, and through design and build contracts, the contractor can often inherit quite a lot of risk. And then so through construction and through into operation, so what this gives us now, once we have this itemized list of Firestops that should be compliant and aligned with manufacturer's test data, we have a mechanism to better control subcontractor installations, and that's really important because there are typically three different subcontractors that will influence, where the partition goes, how big the builder's work opening is, how the services are spaced, how the Firestop is installed. So that's really important. But this process also then gives a model which can be handed over to the client if they're that way inclined and they want a 3D model. It allows us to itemize Firestops as a COBie deliverable, which perhaps they haven't been thought about in that way before. We can use our laser scanning services to validate that services are spaced correctly and align with the test data that we've been using through the process. And we could asset tag those as well through the process in order to cross-reference the asset tag into the COBie data set. And then additional thoughts around all of that data being stored on a common data environment. If the client doesn't have that platform, then we can continue to provide the common data environment platform into the initial stages of operation until the client perhaps adopts their own. And that's us. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Richard and Brent. I'm gonna move straight on in terms of presentations to Reid, and I'm just going to make sure that he can access the slides. But just a reminder from me, if you have got some questions, please fill in them in the question box, and we'll get through them as we go along. And then at the end of this presentation, we've got some time for questions. So over to you, Reid.
Great. Can I move back just one slide? I'm trying to work out how to do that. That was going to be my big having fun slide that you promised at the start, Andrew.
There you are.
So yes, thank you very much. I don't know if I've quite got control yet, but I'll work that out. And time-wise, are we okay for 15 or 20 minutes, Andrew? Yeah, okay. So thank you. And thanks very much to Brent and Richard, which has provided me a really nice segue, if you like, into my presentation. I've been with BAM 22 years, and for virtually all that time I've been in the BAM FM company. It was quite a new company, well, it's brand new when I joined, and we've always had the enormous benefit of being able to sort of look over the shoulders of our construction colleagues and see what they're up to. Sometimes that's quite frightening. I'm joking, of course, but when it comes around to BIM, It's been an enormous benefit. And when Richard mentioned a few moments ago about the skills and the software licenses and these the kind of barriers to entry, I suppose, or they would be seen as barriers of entry to the FM sector because they're unfamiliar skills, they're unfamiliar software tools, then they are a barrier. But from BIM FM's point of view, we've been able to implement those skills and the software within the group and be able to maybe kind of leapfrog what otherwise would have been quite difficult stages of kind of cutting our teeth on this stuff. So that's been an enormous benefit, and maybe helps explain a little bit about how we've got a little bit of a jump on using some of the benefits of BIM in our FM services. As I say, I think it's not a surprise, and it's something we shouldn't beat ourselves up on in the FM industry, that we're slower coming into this use of BIM. The construction industry have been all over this for a few years now, and the experience that Reid have is very good, and we're seeing this implementation having really been embedded now in new D&B projects, and in fact BAM, like others, have mandated 3D modeling in all new projects. So this is very much happened even, and the FM sector will get there, particularly as these projects start coming to us anyway. New projects will arrive with a BIM model and we'll soon know what to do. But this particular slide is kind of reminding us where we were yesterday, maybe still kind of where we are as well. And this is a photo. I know I took this photo. This is absolutely real, and this is asset records in the FM sector, and this is statutory maintenance reports, statutory maintenance forms, all signed and dated and completed. And if you thought you were missing one, how the hell would you find it? How would you know you're missing one or two? How do you know you've got all the fire dampers tested? How do you know you've been to all the right ones? How do you know you didn't do one twice? Paper is enormously ineffective, but by harnessing more digital tools, I think we can all imagine, and we've probably seen in other examples the benefits of adopting digital tools that give us answers much quicker and data that we can actually analyze and use. The quotes on the left are just, I suppose, trying to get out of where we are just now. People saying we've always done it this way. That's not really good enough, and it's certainly not going to attract young professionals into our sector either. We need to become more digital, because they're going to be scratching their heads when we ask them to open up lever arch files. That's kind of yesterday's stuff, And obviously Sir Martin Sorrell saying, sometimes we need to grab the uncomfortable things, but we have to move forward. So I'll now test if I've got control here and pushing the button. I don't know that I do.
Okay, I'll move it forward for you.
Superb. Thank you very much. Thank you, Andrew. So this first slide is a little bit like just a summary of what I'm going to be touching upon. Just trying to kind of succinctly, a bit of an executive summary for you. We have this sort of proposition that buildings equal data now. From a Revit model, we can harvest an enormous amount of data. We can transfer that data from a Kobe drop that Brent described into a CAFM system. That's actually a very straightforward thing to do. We don't need to collect data manually and then type it in line by line into a CAFM system like we were a few years ago. This stuff can be mapped very quickly, very easily, and we can be pretty sure, because contractors are using BIM, that it's already validated and accurate. That's something, again, that we couldn't be very sure of before. We can then have the opportunity to maintain those accurate asset data and records. And that's an important part also of what Richard and Brent were talking about. This isn't just about getting off to a good start on day one. It's about then maintaining that good start in the operational phase. Now, again, in the FM sector, people have said quite often to me, "Oh, these are all new skills, Reid. We don't do this." And actually, the fact is we are obligated to do it. Whether you're a building owner or an FM company, you're obligated to maintain data about what new installations, new pumps, whatever it is you've done, and also statutory maintenance records. So we're not really doing anything new here. We're just using some new tools. Not only is the asset data interesting, but quite often the geometry that we can get for free, if you like, from a construction project can also be immensely useful. Sometimes it takes some different software to run it, but the geometry itself can be useful, and I'll come back to that in some examples a bit later on. But we can then use the geometry and the data from a desk to actually make much better FM decisions. We don't have to go to areas of a building every day with a tape measure to work out what size the walls are or what areas need, what the area of a repainting project is. We can actually start relying on our digital twin, if you like, and use that digital twin to make much better informed decisions, much quicker, much more efficiently. In terms of what customers need to be doing to kind of unlock this potential, I think customers need to understand the art of the possible a little bit, and to start specifying to the supply chain that customers want a PAS standard or a new European standard for BIM to be implemented, or sort of a digital standard for BIM to be implemented. And I guess customers have to consider what asset information requirements have they got in their organization, and how are those translated into what's called employer information requirements. That's the information that the contractor will bring back to you. I'm going to try that button again. Andrew, could you pop me forward one?
Okay.
I'm sure we'll get this sorted. So Brent had said I had a couple of nice graphics here. There's two charts I'm going to show you now that are representative. These are not to any particular scale, but they're representative of what I'm talking about. And what they're illustrating here is at the start of a project, a customer knows everything, or a client in this case knows everything about their project, and they engage with a building contractor who comes along and catches up with the detail and the understanding, the knowledge of the project, and eventually they actually overtake the customer. They know more than anybody. Normally, all of that time, the operator or the FM provider, internal or external, doesn't really matter, but they tend to be kept at arm's length. Nobody really wants to let them in because they'll just spoil it. And at the end of the contract, the builder leaves, all the site teams all go on to other sites. The client tries to work out what they got, and the FM contractor suddenly arrives and has to learn everything overnight. We often have a little bit of training and some O&M manuals, but when you look at the volume of paper that's involved, at practical completion, it's just unsatisfactory, really. And an FM contractor has to learn a lot very quickly and gather asset data, probably incompletely, I suppose I would say, using their eyes to gather what they can see and put that into the CAFM system. And we then beat ourselves up that there's a performance gap, but it's not really a surprise, because there's these transfers of knowledge and understanding, and we've lost the golden thread. There is no golden thread because the knowledge keeps falling between us. And as you see in the operational period, there's every chance as well that information keeps getting lost as individuals come and go from an FM provider, again, internal or external. If it's an external provider, then whole contractors come and go, and they take information and knowledge with them every time they're replaced. So there's a lot of inefficiency designed in to how we traditionally do things. The next slide is showing what's possible. So by implementing the 3D environment and the collection of asset data as the design is progressed, as Brent was showing us in those different design stages, then you can actually shorten those gaps and make the gaps much, much smaller. much less inefficient, and you have the opportunity for an FM contractor to hit the ground running because they're already familiar with the assets and sometimes the geometry as well, if they've been involved in the 3D models for a project. And equally, that data, if it's maintained, then the gaps during the operational period after handover become much smaller. As I say, these are illustrative, and I hope you can see them as that rather than being to scale. So some examples then, just to kind of try and make this stuff feel a bit more real again from my representative graphs. We were involved in 2013 in an academy school in London, and we had a Revit model for that. It was pre-BIM, but what we did is we actually went back to our internal BIM design company and asked them to load up data into the Revit model, and we created a federated model. So we had an architectural model that was full of the geometry, 3D geometry of the architecture, you know, the building fabric and the floors and the walls and the ceilings. Plus we attached asset data to those objects. We had a structural model. We didn't do too much with that because from an FM point of view, we're not so interested in the bolts that hold things together. They're less of a priority. And that again is something Richard had touched on a few minutes ago. Start with your sort of red, amber, green items, and structure from an FM point of view tends to be less important than MEP and your finishes, wall, floor finishes and ceiling finishes. So we had that. We had believe it or not, an FF&E model. But just the way the FF&E being procured, it had all the rooms had been loaded up with FF&E, so we had a very comprehensive furniture, fittings and equipment model, not just fixed furniture, but loose furniture and equipment as well, which was a fabulous thing to have, and an MEP model, of course. Without the MEP model, you know, it would have been quite lacking. So we started using that, and again, I'll come back to some examples of that later on. Having the benefit of that behind us, we moved on to this project that's illustrated on the page here, which is a building called Connections in Glasgow, which was a BAM developed, BAM designed, BAM built, and BAM FM, believe it or not, contract. Although the ultimate measure of success for this project was that BAM Properties would sell it before it was finished. That was the mark of success. And with that in mind, BAM FM began sort of an exercise of preparing a maintenance price for the unfinished building about 6 months before it was finished, 6 to 7 months before it was finished. And every 2 weeks we received a Kobe drop. And in that Kobe drop, as you can see on the right hand side, we had fan coil units and MEP items, all sorts of things in there. We got a complete list of all the assets in the building. And we were also able to do a 3D walk round, so we could go into the plant rooms, into the risers, into the lifts. We were all over the place virtually, and we had an asset list, and we were quite, every 2 weeks it was quite straightforward for us to create an FM, a planned maintenance price, and give that to the developer who then put that together with to create a service fee. And they attracted several tenants because it was a very competitive service fee. And because of the BIM model and our confidence in the asset data, we were able to give some efficiencies in the data we were going to have to gather at the start of an FM contract and in the maintenance itself. So it was a very efficient service fee. And because we attracted some tenants to the property, it was successfully sold before it was finished to Deutsche Bank. And BAM FM continued to deliver a service there even now. So, you know, the power of that asset data was illustrating that you could have procured an FM contractor many months before handover, which you could never do before, but you can do that now. And that allows the FM contractor to then be ready for service delivery. Like I showed you on the graph, we don't have this sudden learning curve to go through. We can actually be quite familiar with everything that's going on in that building before the start. Wharfdale Hospital is relevant because it was a retro BIM project. The industry, I was going around giving a few talks at the time, and the industry kept saying to me, do you know, Reid, that's very good, but 95% buildings already built. So, you know, the FM sector is only ever going to have a small amount of new buildings. And I said, well, I think these principles are good for existing buildings. So we created a retro BIM model using just DWG drawings. We effectively gave them depth, made them into 3D Revit drawings, and then we started attaching asset data to the objects in the model. What was interesting about that, it was very cost effective. And what we did is these other models that the construction industry develops, I call them Rolls-Royce models because they're dimensionally perfect. They're just fabulous. But if you already have a building, you already have a boiler, you don't need to model it perfectly to know that it's going to coordinate into a space. It's already in the space. As long as you've got an object that's about the right size and about the right location, then that's sufficient to attach data to and to illustrate the boiler. Equally, fire dampers, we didn't need to draw them perfectly. We didn't even need to draw them at the right size, but we located fire dampers and thermostatic mixing valves in about the right place throughout the building. And we were able to also add barcodes to that to make sure that when we're doing maintenance, we're going to the right asset, scanning it, and we created a digital checklist. So for the first time, instead of checking lots of paper records and not really knowing what we have or haven't got, we had a digital record and we know exactly what we've got. So a huge step forward at Wharfdale. We also, for the private sector, did a customer centre at York for an insurance company, and for a developer in London, Broadwick Street development, where we were also involved in the EIR, helping them develop that stuff. And again, we found ourselves being involved in asset tagging and a number of other activities where we were actually contributing to the EIR. So this is just to give you a wee flavour for what COBie means. Brent mentioned COBie, and it's a funny old word that's kind of come out of nowhere. Obviously, everyone's talking about COBie. I think it's Construction Operating Building Information Exchange, isn't it? And it's not something to be frightened of. It's actually something to really welcome. It's a common Excel format. So we've all got Excel, and we all know what to do with Excel. So that's a pretty good start. And this is an output that comes from a BIM model, a federated BIM model. So it's not something we need to worry in the FM sector too much about. It'll arrive populated and it will be accurate. And if we've given our design teams and construction teams good EIRs, then these columns and rows will be populated with data we need. There may be too much data. It's often a problem, actually, there's too much data, but we can harvest from this what we need. And you might not be able to read it, but in some of these columns are things like serial number, warranty start date, warranty end date, really useful, practical things for the FM contractor to know, or the building owner to know. We've even got space for things like bar tag, barcode numbers or SQL numbers that can go on here too. So the data is being collected, in a very practical way. It's practical data that we can use, and of course, what we would be looking to do is then update those warranty periods. If we replace a pump with a new pump and we have a new 12-month warranty arriving, then we could be updating that information. And the next slide. Yeah, so Andrew and I are going to have to like dance a little dance here because what I'm going to show you now is just a typical example of an EIR, or if you like, the COBie data you want in the EIR. That's on the right-hand side. And this example shows an air handling unit. So this is actually for the Broadwick Street development. We decided this was the information we wanted to collect for an air handling unit. And I'm going to show you how we collected it. And item by item, we'll strike off how we're doing it. So first of all, when we decided it was an air handling unit that was going in the space, then a classification toolkit by Autodesk identified that as a uniclass code. So we had a uniclass code for the air handling unit, and you can see that item gets struck off. And Andrew, if you press the button again, the architect then provided a location, a floor code, and a room number. So it's effectively like an address, so we can get to that air handling unit. We know where it is. You can see those items come off from the EIR. And again, Andrew. Thank you. MEP modeler, so this is the MEP designer, then provided some more information that's specific to this MEP asset. We're pushing it through glue. We were then, and these are just, you know, there are other tools out there, I suppose you should say. Then the engineer was able, when the actual fan arrived, the air handling unit arrived with its fan and its equipment, was able to then complete these other bits of data specific for that asset. The building services manager, which is the BAM kind of MEP supervisor, completed some more details, serial number and things, data installed with the warranty details I was talking a moment ago. What's interesting about this project is we decided there was certain bits of information that the FM provider should provide. We were already on board, so we were able to add these bits here, a cost center, for example, for the maintenance of that item in the future, and a health and safety risk assessment was attached to the asset. And finally, we pushed all of that to our CAFM system. Well, when I say all of it, all the asset data that was useful for this EIR, those other bits of data were then maintained in you know, in files and things. Again, I can describe that in a bit more detail. But what you can see here is how an EIR is delivered through a project. So the next slide, and I think you might have to press it twice, Andrew, just to get rid of that. My animations, back one. My animation skills weren't that good. Here we are. So then picking up from the model through COBie, what we're doing is we're kind of harvesting the information and pushing it into an asset information model. Now the asset information model is a term that's used in the sort of guidance, government guidance and things. It's really just like a electronic data management or file serve, a place to save your files. And what we've done, and people might choose to do it slightly differently, but we harvest asset data and we push that through our EDMS, our electronic data management system, to what's called CE here. That's concept evolution. That's our CAFM system. And it's an SQL database, but the asset data is held in there. And from that, using Uniclass, we can then push out very quickly our SFG20 maintenance regime, for example. We can then, obviously in concept evolution, like any CAFM system, you can shift that around so it's a bit more efficient, but effectively it auto-generates a maintenance program from the assets because they've been properly coded. That's an enormously powerful thing and saves a lot of time. What we also then store in our electronic data management system here, this file store, is we also store the 3D model. I mean, here that's also called drawings. We also maintain other documents that we might have received, you know, manufacturers' documents and files like that, and the COBie file itself. The idea being that we don't really want to duplicate asset data in the concept evolution system and in the file store, but we don't really have much choice right now. Maybe some point in the future we'll be able to be a little bit more sophisticated, but auto updating, we tried in the early projects to kind of auto update the assets in CAFM and the assets in the file store, but we just have to have a manual intervention there, and at certain frequencies check that all of our assets are correct in both. Just a little bit of a kind of management process we've had to consider there. So a couple of examples then. Rather than do any live examples that can tend to go horribly wrong, I've just loaded some pictures here. So on the left, you can see one of our technicians actually in a space, but using his kind of digital twin on an iPad, these two pictures on the right-hand side illustrate how in that space, he's able to turn off the ceiling and see what's above the space, sprinkler pipes, various bits of MEP, supply and extract ductwork. And then further over, he's also been able, just with the touch of a button, to turn off the FF&E model. So you can turn off an individual surface, like a ceiling. You could turn off a floor or a wall just by tapping on it and saying, you know, hide. But you're also able to turn off a whole model. So he's turned off all furniture and equipment, and you get an empty room without a ceiling. And what we were encouraging with our team there was but if there's a customer, we had an example, maybe a customer in a room that had a lamp that was flickering, and we said, would be normal, sorry, in the FM sector, what would be normal is to go take a look and say, yes, it is flickering, and work out that it's a 600 mil fluorescent tube, go away, get one, come back and fix it. What we can do is, if someone tells us it's a flickering tube, we don't need to go to the room to find out what kind of tube that is. We can see that by touching a luminaire, and we can get all the luminaire details, the size of all the tubes. So we can arrive at the first time of asking and fix the job, knowing what the asset is. Now, that's kind of unusual in the FM sector. We've always gone to have a look first, and it's inefficient because we're going there twice, and it's disturbing our customer twice. And if we can overcome that, then that's an enormous benefit. So we can go to rooms by their listing. So if someone says I'm in room 101, there's a flickering light, we can go to room 101 and have a view of that room, or we can go by asset. If it's a PPM activity and someone's saying check or do a routine maintenance on pump number 1, then we can find pump number 1 and then locate it to go straight to it. We already know what tools and what equipment to be taking with us before we arrive. And these modern iPads, like you see here, are making this extremely accessible and available for engineers either on site or engineers in a mobile van. So the next 2 slides are just a couple of endorsements. So this technician whose photo we just saw was describing how he was able to scale back walls. I think on a couple of occasions we were able to find isolation valves and isolate leaks very quickly, things like this, using the functionality that we could turn on and off walls and ceilings. And the next slide, which is my last slide, is then from an engineer. So this is a mobile engineer, less familiar with this specific building, but able to interrogate the model and the sort of digital twin, if you like, from his van. So he hasn't even parked yet. He's maybe somewhere else in London, but when he gets a call through, he could search by asset or by location and arrive not just with maybe a better understanding of where he's going and what he's going to be doing, but even with the right access equipment. So by visualizing that room, you can understand whether a 3-step ladder is going to be sufficient or not, making us again far more efficient and much less inconvenience to our customers. So okay. I hope that's been useful. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much for that, Reid. Just a couple of quick questions to you first from that have been sent in through by the audience, and again thank you for those questions. Hopefully we'll get through them all in a minute. Firstly, specifically relating to COBie, how easy is it to update the COBie data, and is it real time, or do you then have to fill in the Excel spreadsheet manually?
Is that for me?
Yeah. Sorry, Reid. Yeah.
No, that's okay. That's okay. So, yeah, we've got a very clever. Part of this is about the skills that we were talking about at the start, and we probably 18, maybe 24 months ago now, we actually employed an analyst, a data analyst, which was the strangest thing for us to do, because whilst that role is maybe well known in other industries, we didn't have a job spec or a job description for it. We really kind of struggled with trying to describe the role, but once we got it out there, we found there was a lot of capability, and there's actually thousands of these people out there. Most of them are working for banks, things like this. But we got an analyst, and what he's able to do is look into our concept evolution system and effectively only update the assets that have changed. So in our concept evolution system, our assets exist, and we generate a maintenance history. And then only where an asset's changed does he replace the asset with the new data, and effectively that's coming from the model, because it's the model that's the source of that. What is interesting about it as well is the old data is always then, whilst it's archived, it's maintained. So we still have a record for maintaining the items that have been superseded. They're just taken out of the live system. So we're not sending people to maintain stuff that has been removed.
Okay, and one sort of, again, general question, which I'll open up also then to Richard and Brent as well, which is, I mean, clearly, and again, this was part of our discussion yesterday. What we've shown here is how BIM can work in complex buildings. How does that translate into particularly a lot of our housing association and local authorities with smaller housing stock, again, which Richard alluded to in his presentation? So sort of Reid first in terms of the advantages of this, but its transferability into residential accommodation.
Yeah. So BAM, we don't have many residential sites for BAM construction or BAM FM. We do have some sort of centralized plants that we maintain in flat and that kind of accommodation. So maybe Richard and Brent can add to this, but it's technically it is highly transferable. The same approach could be adopted many times, many different kind of situations. I think what does change is the asset information requirement. So different types of organization might have slightly different priority on the type of data that they're most interested in. And I think that it all sounds very difficult, but when you actually, if you go back to some of the government guidance and you talk about asking yourself simple questions, then actually the answers come at you quite easily about where are our risks and what asset information can help me manage that. Those questions are quite easily asked and actually quite easily answered. In some respects, you might actually be disappointed how easy it is, because you kind of prepare, you sort of steel yourself for a really difficult workshop, and 20 minutes later you're almost finished. You think, wow, I didn't even finish my tea. So,
okay, Richard, sorry, what's your...
Yeah, so in my view, it isn't a one-size-fits-all solution, really. Most housing providers are operating with their housing management system, which is essentially a transactional processing system, mostly to get your rent in. Somebody somewhere then has thought about bolting on an asset management module, and frankly, none of them are that good. They're in there for the purposes of so-called integration. But if you compare a CAFM system, for example, with a housing asset system, they are poles apart in terms of their data and their functionality. There are some core principles about being built in SQL or holding asset data, but the way in which they're used and are processed is very different. And that's why we suggest for the housing providers to think about the complex and high-rise blocks first. So it may well be appropriate to hold BIM information or a more sophisticated method of maintenance of data for a high-rise block or a series of high-rise blocks. Whereas that would be a complete sledgehammer to crack a nut for a single dwelling, an end of terrace semi or whatever it might be. That would be too much. And I think, to me, the deciding factor there is the complexity of the services that go into that building. So when you're into complex plant rooms and equipment and risers and all sorts of other stuff, where the servicing and statutory obligations are that much greater, I think the type of technology that Reid has described and we've been providing data capture for, I think is absolutely spot on. Should that ultimately be rolled out to the low-rise stock? Well, potentially, but if you are building new estates and you have that designed in a Revit model, there's absolutely no reason why you shouldn't be linking that information through COBie into BIM. So, for example, you know that your dwelling has 8 windows and you know exactly what what square meterage they are, because that's all designed in the model. So why on earth are you getting your poor stock condition surveyor to go around and capture that same data time and time again? The one thing that surveyor should be doing is telling you what the condition is. So has it deteriorated? When do we renew it? So that's the live update. The fact it's a window and the fact it's made of PVC and the fact it's 2 meters squared doesn't ever change. And we're not smart enough to link all of that technology through at the moment.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, in terms of the sort of question on the screen, and again, we've had a couple of other questions, similar, to this around, the sort of costs in the business case for all this, and also linked to that, where the data should be held sort of internally or with a third party. Brent, can I sort of start with you in terms of sort of addressing that, those sort of two issues. Where should the data be, and then just trying to explore then that the business case.
Great question. So I think again, it's horses for courses, because one size doesn't necessarily fit all, but really larger client organizations or housing associations or whatever client entity might have the funds available and the capabilities internally to procure platforms to manage this and to employ the resources to manage this information internally. But then, and others might not be. But I'd say that those that aren't, there are still ways and means of using the data that would come from BIM. It doesn't necessarily mean going out and buying Revit or going out and buying a common data environment platform to store and manage that information, because as Reid touched on, the data that we're talking about, Kobe, is transferred in Excel. It can be managed and updated in Excel. So I'd say that as an entry point is near to free, because most people have that as standard built in their PCs anyway. And that kind of aligns with what Richard was saying with regards to we don't want to kind of recreate the wheel with regards to sending a stock condition surveyor out to survey how many assets there are. The Kobe data set will contain that. They can use that as a starting point for how many assets there are. And in time, there are free viewers that can be used to look at models. It won't give them access to update that geometry, but that may be the kind of stepping stone, is using free viewers like Navisworks, Freedom, or Celebri anywhere to just open up models and look at them and explore things. And in time, as matures, as organizations mature and increase in size and start to be more confident with it, they might invest in Revit, or they might invest in a common data environment platform or a CAFM platform or whatever it might be. So I think there are different ways to look at it, but it's clearly, there are good entry points for using them.
Okay, that's thanks.
I think that the compulsion, to my mind,
carry on.
The compulsion to my mind here is that it has the ability to make you more efficient. Ultimately, if you have this data, you don't need to keep recapturing, and you can use it. It takes away some of the guesswork when it comes to subsequent maintenance, and Reid gave examples of very simply being able to take away ceiling layers within the model to actually see what's behind it. So, tracking, tracing, looking at diagnostics in terms of errors and failures is going to be that much more efficient in the future. So whilst there may be an initial cost in model development, you don't have to repeat that. What you do need to do is to keep maintaining your asset data in terms of works that you have done and changes that occur, but those are very minor in comparison. And the opportunity to provide that security of golden thread, which is exactly what we're all being asked to do, there's no better way.
Yeah, okay. I'm really conscious of time, and I know a few people have had to leave, but I'm going to just going to skip that question and move on to the end. And also, I sort of want to bring in Phil, who I know has waited patiently for the question. So in terms of advice, and again, particularly from your perspective, I'm going to start with you, Phil, in terms of, you know, what are the little bits of advice that you would want to leave people with in terms of implementing BIM?
Yeah, thanks. I think you've got to look at BIM as an investment. Yes, there's a cost, and the risk you're taking is the future value of that information. And that's got lots of different ways you can look at it. I think we talked about the immediate term around demonstrating compliance and assurance and the golden thread. If you move forward from the immediate term into maybe the soon time frame, you might look at things like procurement risk. When you actually go to tender for the things, do you have the information? If you don't have the information, contractors are going to price risk. So BIM can be a really good way of storing that information and making sure you can generate efficiencies through that tender process. I think if you look in the not too far away time frame, you get to the position, can you afford not to? So you've got regulators looking for evidence-based decision making. So BIM can give you the refinement, the quality of data to do that. You've got investors piling money into sort of Google, Apple and Tesla, and interested in tech, and investors want to see that you're using that information. And so can you borrow at the right rates? If you don't have the right information, you can't provide the assurance that you're up to speed. And with that data, you can do other things. So there's already people developing artificial intelligence algorithms out there to process that data. So to put Richard and Brent out of a job, but do you need to send a stock condition surveyor to go and collect all your asset information, or can you have the software go and count all the windows and the sizes? I'll take the point that yes, you do need to look at condition, but actually you can reduce the cost of some of those activities potentially in future. I think the key for me is around the fact this isn't a one-off exercise. So you can spend a chunk of money, and we've all seen people do one-off exercises. We've seen 5-year out-of-date stock condition surveys that are pretty much useless for anything other than the sort of financial planning aspects. If you really want to use information, you've got to keep those models up to date. So for me, there's a piece that says, do you need to look at your existing asset managers, upskill them, think of the apprenticeship levy, use that money, train people in Revit, etc., etc. So you've got the ability to update those models, and I appreciate that won't be accessible to everybody. And then the other part of it would be look at those maintenance activities, the improvements, the works, and how do you give access to those models to get them updated? So is that, and the technology is pretty much here. You don't need expensive laser scanners. A smartphone now will measure distance. You know, you can do a point cloud, move a camera through a room, and have an up-to-date vision every time a repair is done. Every time something's installed, you can update that model. So this isn't a one-off, do it and forget it. You have to maintain that process. So there's a bit of the internal piece around the staff, your long-term strategy for information management, but I think you've also then got to figure out your other third parties. So your larger contractors, and obviously BIM a good example of that, really familiar with BIM. Not every organisation you interact with will have that capability. So not only do you have to look at training your own staff, but I think you also need to look at supply development with your supply chain. So if you're implementing a new model, if you're changing your operating business processes to become more integral, you need to look at making that investment in supply development along that journey as well. So for me, the sort of sum of my bit of advice would be, it's not one thing you just put on the shelf and leave. You need to keep up to date. The more you put into it is the more you will get out. Think about your long-term strategy, and ultimately you will probably need in the early stages to seek some advice from some professionals that have got that knowledge and experience to steer you in the right direction. And sort of the shameless plug for us is, you know, we do have a consultants framework with a number of consultants that can help you with that if you need it.
Okay, thank you, Reid. What would be your take?
Well, I kind of agree with all of that. That was easy. But no, for the sake of variety, I suppose I would say that sometimes BIM, people think of BIM as a technology project. And I'd say it's not. It's an information management project. It's about gathering information and managing it, and not really having any obligations more than we've already got just doing it in a slightly different way, but probably a far better way actually. So my recommendation, I suppose, or my two things to think about would be about keeping in your mind BIM as a simple thing, a kind of a digital version of kind of the things that we should be doing just now anyway. But I can't help but overlap with Phil. It's more about a little bit of change management, about implementing a slightly different way of doing things, a better way of doing things with our teams, because otherwise it'll never really bed in, and they'll just keep bouncing off it and doing the traditional thing. I suppose the second piece of advice is we at the start kind of slightly focused on the Rolls-Royce models because they looked so cool. Actually, that was vanity, and start with the data. The data is actually the gold for FM. Having asset data that is from a BIM model is just so good, and to simply throw it away should really be criminal. You know, you just shouldn't be allowed to do that. So
okay, yeah, thanks for that. But let's have a comment from you, Brent, and then finally Richard.
Okay, I'll come in quickly on this. So I think a phrase that's often used with regards to BIM is starting with the end in mind. So making sure that you're thinking about the use of that data at the end and formulating your requirements before procuring any contractors, before procuring any consultants, and make sure that if you do have an internal FM team or you're planning to use a contractor for your FM purposes, get them involved in writing those requirements and be absolutely explicit about what you want in terms of model and data. And if you want data, be clear about which assets you want it for, which pieces of information you want against those assets, and who and how that information is delivered for each of those pieces.
Excellent. Okay, Richard.
Yeah, I'd reinforce that and sort of insist upon it for all of your new constructions, because that data is really important and has value. And then think about the extent of how and when you will collect it for your existing portfolio. Start with the more complex buildings would be the recommendation.
Okay, that's great. So thank you very much to our audience for bearing with us. We did run a little bit over time. I suspected we might, because there was such a lot to cover. So thank you for our audience for bearing with me. If you did ask a question, and there were a couple of questions that I didn't get round to asking, I am going to ask the panel to address them, and we will circulate those responses. All I want to do now is on your behalf, our audience behalf, to thank the speakers today. So a big thanks to Brett and Richard from Ridge, and to Reid from BAM, and for Phil for answering some of those questions. We look forward to seeing you all again. We're hoping to have a further webinar in a couple of weeks' time. So enjoy the rest of the afternoon. As ever, stay safe. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you all again soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.